There we go. It's recording. All right. Um, I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to the Howell Speaker Series hosted by the University of Virginia. My name is Fahad Pshala, and I'm an associate professor of history here at UVA, but I also hold a position in Arabian Peninsula and Gulf Studies. This is a series that seeks to highlight the excellent work that is being done on the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf. It's also an opportunity for all of us who work on the region to see one another and connect to one another beyond the usual academic conferences, which, let's face it, these days are not happening anyway. You'll be seeing a lot of these in the coming years, inshallah. We hope to have one of these every month or so, at least during the academic year. And sometimes we'll feature individual speakers, other times groups of speakers and roundtables. And at other times, we'll feature events and workshops that we are co-organizing with the Association for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies. And the hope is that even in the post-Zoom world that we will hopefully all transition into at some point, we'll keep the fire going over in this corner of the internet, so that people from around the country and around the world can tune in and participate. Okay, before I introduce our speakers today, I want to give a quick shout out, I guess. Although this is hosted by UVA, we're able to run this programming thanks to the generous support of Ambassador Nathaniel Howell and his wife, Marge Howell. The Howells spent much of the 1970s and 1980s in various diplomatic roles in the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. Nat Howell served and sort of rounded out his foreign service career as the US ambassador to Kuwait from 1987 until December 1990, and so up to and through the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait that year. I'm personally grateful to the Howells for their support, not just for the program here at UVA, but for their support for the Gulf Studies community writ large. So we're lucky to have them. Okay, on to today's talk. We're here to talk about Neha, Vora, Ahmed, Kanna, and Amelie Renard's book, Beyond Exception, New Interpretations of the Arabian Peninsula, just recently published by Cornell University Press. Neha Vora is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Lafayette College and is the author of two other books on the region, Impossible Citizens, Dubai's Indian Diaspora, published in 2013, and Teach for Arabia, American Universities, Liberalism and Transnationalism in Qatar, published in 2018. Ahmed Kanna is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of the Pacific and is the author of the book Dubai, the City as Corporation, published in 2011. Another book, Rethinking Global Urbanism, Comparative Insight from Secondary Cities, published in 2012. And then The Superlative City, Dubai and the Urban Condition in the Early 21st Century, published in 2013. It was a very, very busy few years for Ahmed. And then last but certainly not least, Amelie Renard is a researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research. I won't even try to pronounce the French name for the institution because I'll butcher it. She is the author of A Society of Young Women, Opportunities of Place, Power, and Reform in Saudi Arabia, published in 2014. And between the three of them, they've authored more articles than I can count. Beyond Exception is thus a collaborative effort between these three, and dare I say, exceptional researchers, each of whom has spent at least a decade, if not more, engaging in the ethnographic study of the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf. The book does a tremendous job of unpacking some of the Orientalist tropes and stereotypes that plague much of the fly-by-night research that we see on the region, and of taking stock of the exciting work being done in history and the social sciences. For newcomers to the field, especially those who are interested in ethnographically inflected projects, this is perhaps the best intro to the field out there. And it's no surprise given that these are authors or scholars who have shaped the literature on anthropology in the Gulf. So I'll be speaking with the presenters for the first 30 minutes or so, just to get the conversation going, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A, although we have more time budgeted, so we can go over if we need to. I'll field the questions once we move to Q&A, and I'll remind you that at the time. So for Q&A, please either use the raise hand function or send a message to me and I'll read it out for you. Okay, let me first unmute our authors. That might be a good way to do it. Ahmed, did you get the, okay, there we go. And Amelie. And then Neha. Okay.
I just want to say my internet connection is really poor in my house. So if I get cut off, I apologize ahead of time.
It's a good thing you got two backups over here. So
Yes, exactly. The cunning plan.
All right, so just to get the conversation going, I'd like to ask you all how you all came to write this book together. It's really unusual to see collaborative efforts of this sort in the study of the region, but also in the sort of the humanities and social sciences more generally. At what point did you decide that this was a book that needed to be written, and why?
So I can start with that. This has been in the works for a really long time. I was like thinking back this morning to how we initially started. Ahmed and I were on a panel, and I think it was like maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And there was some uncomfortableness in terms of the way that the audience received what we had to say, particularly about Western privilege in the Gulf. And so we started talking about our own, embodied subject positions and how those are received by our Gulf Studies colleagues and by other folks in the audience, and came up with the idea to write a piece together that would reflect upon what it is like to do field work and also what it is like to circulate in the academy, being who we are. And we turned that into a conference paper initially. Our editor, Jim Lance at Cornell, reached out to Ahmed, because editors usually do this. They'll go through the conference program and they'll reach out to folks who they feel like the topic sounds like something they would be interested in pursuing. So we sat down with Jim and had a conversation, and we didn't really, he wasn't keen on the idea of it being a edited volume. So we were like, this would be a great thing to like turn into something that's larger and co-authored. Around the same time, and Amelie, you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but it was around the same time that Amelie and I were at a conference and I think that's the last time actually the three of us were together, was when we first started talking about this project. And having conversations with Amelie actually brought in a whole other layer, because, it kind of pushed us to decenter this like American Academy focus that we had in that original conference paper, and brought in a whole other layer of fieldwork experience, especially with Amelie's work both in Riyadh and in Dubai. So we decided to turn it into a co-authored book, and we did all of our work, virtually. We did it all in Google Docs, and we would meet over Skype. This is in the days before Zoom. And actually we would meet at this exact time, because it's 9 a.m. for Ahmed in California, it's noon for me, and it's 6 p.m. for Amelie in Paris. So this is our standard meeting time. And we were hoping that we would be able to get together and celebrate this in person, but unfortunately with the pandemic, we don't know when that's going to happen.
I think it's next to me, according to what we decided, right? So should I go next? And I want to apologize to Neha because I missed the very last part of what you said as my internet froze everyone. So again, apologies for that. So the only thing I would add to Neha's great observation is that I think in anthropology, it's quite common to think of what we're doing as a dialogue, or in this case, dialogue between three people. I don't know what the trio version of that is.
The trialogue.
Sorry? Trialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think we're used to thinking of being like in conversation with other scholars and with our interlocutors and so on. But it's very rare, I think, to find co-written, especially books. And we thought it would be really an interesting experiment and a valuable contribution to have three, I think three people who really admire each other's work. I mean, I think Amelie and Neha are totally brilliant. It doesn't need to be said. But also we come from, I think, different also perspectives, like in a substantive way. So the writing was, in a way, we had like really good and sometimes, we had good conversations and sometimes I would say debates and in the good sense of the term, arguments about how to frame certain parts of the book, or what sort of our core arguments were, and what theoretical sort of perspectives were coming from. So the actual practice of writing it was really, I think, helped at least me become a much better scholar and writer, and I would recommend everyone consider doing that. So that is all I'm going to say.
Okay. All right. I wasn't sure if Amelie wanted to add to that, or if okay.
Yeah, I can add something. So hi everyone, can you hear me? Yes? Yes, okay. So yeah, I think it was very interesting to come back on our beginnings in the field and in Gulf studies. And for me, like rereading the book right now, yeah, I feel kind of relieved to read what was the experience of like trying to do gender studies about Saudi Arabia in the years 2000, because it was really like, I mean, it was difficult to bring this perspective in studies that existed about Saudi Arabia and that were all about like political Islam and oil and so on. So I think it was really great. It was a great opportunity to exchange about how we experienced both fieldwork and the academic field, and it's really good to have this opportunity to not to keep this story just for ourselves, but to share our impressions and so on and experiences. So yeah, I'm very glad we did this.
Well, I'm glad that you did it as well. And although I'm sorry that you all didn't get to celebrate the publication of the book, hopefully this is something like a mini celebration, at least marking that it was published and we're here to talk about it. So I'm going to ask a couple of basic questions, in part to get the conversation going, but in part as a reflection of my own ignorance as a historian among anthropologists. And so I wonder if you could speak to us about this idea of exceptionalism and what you mean by exception or exceptionalism as a trope, but also as a sort of framework for the study of the Arabian Peninsula. From speaking from my own position of ignorance, how is this idea of exceptionalism different from, say, like Orientalism, which we're all more familiar with as a concept?
Yeah, so exceptionalism is, I think it's linked to Orientalism, because we analyze some typically Orientalist tropes about the Arabian Peninsula, like many discourses about the Arabian Peninsula oppose the West and the East, tradition and modernity, these kind of things. If you take gender, also the image of women in the Arabian Peninsula very often is in continuity with Orientalist tropes, with the seclusion, oppression, and sometimes also hypersexualization. So there are lines of continuity, but the reason why we wanted to talk about exceptionalism is also that the tropes go beyond Orientalist, like typical Orientalist tropes. For instance, you have this discourse about hypermodernity and inauthenticity that is very strong when you talk about cities like Dubai, Doha. So that's a trope that is not really linked to Orientalism, or it's a new Orientalism. And also it's the idea that we need concepts that are, I mean, we oppose the idea that we really need like specific concepts, such as the oil states, the kafala system, and so on, and concepts that think of the Arabian Peninsula as disconnected from the rest of the world and having really like exceptional problems and exceptional conceptions of the state and society and nationals and migrants and so on. So I think it's basically the idea that we want concepts and approaches that enable us to connect the Arabian Peninsula to global dynamics and also to imperial history, post-colonial history, and so on.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up because it sort of feeds into the next question that I had, which is what it means to de-exceptionalize the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, to move, as the title suggests, to move beyond exception. And is that the same as, say, globalizing it, as just sort of embedding it within a sort of a more global fabric of connections and circulations? And yeah.
Okay, so I think that one is, maybe I'll take that one on, if that's okay with my colleagues and comrades. Yeah, so that is also a really great question. I think that, well, first of all, echoing what Amelie said, I think the term de-exceptionalizing, exceptionalizing it goes way beyond what Orientalism, the referent of Orientalism has traditionally been. But I think, one of the things we were trying to do, or at least, maybe my own thinking on this was de-exceptionalizing the Arabian Peninsula is a bit more, we think of it as a bit sharper of an intervention than just saying we're going to look at the peninsula from a quote unquote global perspective. And I think globalization becomes this kind of trend of talking about the international scale, especially in the 1990s. And here I'm traversing on my political scientist colleagues, I'm sure, so I'm sure you'll probably correct me on this, but in the 1990s, you see this idea of globalization come up, and it becomes a sort of way of obscuring politics in my view, and it's obscuring the material analysis of how economic relations are produced and reproduced. And so I think de-exceptionalizing the Arabian Peninsula allows us to talk about, just like Amelie said, political issues of the politics of the legacies of colonialism, of ongoing imperialism, the ways in which, from my perspective, I think, coming from a more sort of Marxist perspective, that actually the political interests of rulers often are in contradiction to those who are, not elites or who are workers. And, I think, I'll give you one example. Like one of the tropes that we critique in the book is this idea of, when Gulf states come up with this idea of like asal, your national heritage or your ethnicity as like a category that's central for national citizenship, right? And sort of like this idea that nationals are like this privileged class and that it's an obvious thing who a national is, right? Well, if you look at it really closely, as someone like Adam Hania did, that idea really comes up in the mid-20th century, the 1950s, 1960s. And what's going on there? The overwhelming majority of the workers in Saudi Arabia were Saudi at that time, but they were also they were militant too in general. They would have a lot of strikes and a lot of political demands. And so, you see this across, I think, the Gulf, the idea of asal and national identity and national heritage start becoming like a project, an elite project to try to manage and try to divide, sort of people along national identity lines now. So there's different kinds of work being done by different national communities, which is a divisive kind of a project. So I think that's like a small example that I cite in my own chapter about sort of the materialist like analysis of where things like asal and kafala and all these things come from. So I'll stop there.
I can add to that. I think that, building on what Ahmed just said, some of the ways that we take like given knowledge about the Gulf for granted and then utilize it in our own academic productions. Like, for example, this idea, and I think all three of us are guilty of having done it at some point in our career, but this idea of like citizens being this one homogenous group versus migrant workers being another group, and that are just so, in such a stark hierarchy, right? Some of those ideas are also making us complicit with some of these elite projects, and that's one of the places that we wanted to also explore and kind of think about how, as ethnographers and as knowledge producers, what are our stakes and what's our responsibility in terms of the kind of presumptions that go into a research project from the beginning. How are our interlocutors also implicated in that? When you're in the Gulf, you traffic in these vocabularies all the time, and yet when we look, one layer below, and you look at what people are actually doing and who they're actually interacting with, the kind of stark vocabularies don't really hold up anymore. And if you're not going in with that kind of critical gaze, you're going to reproduce the pre-existing assumptions. So that's a way that we were really kind of thinking about method in our conversations when we were having this, when we were writing the book.
Yeah, and I think it's also the idea that we tried to build in the conclusion that, it's first trying to deconstruct the stereotypes we have on the region, but also analyzing how these stereotypes are used by different interlocutors and beyond, like Westerners and the media and the academia and so on. Like, it's very like the stereotypes are very routinely used by different people in the region. And I think once we question these stereotypes, the Arabian Peninsula can also be like the beginning of other questionings and other reflections, for instance, about the national foreigner divide. Like, after the book, we all think that no research should begin from this divide, to like no object should be, okay, since I'm going to work on Saudi Arabia, I'm going to study only nationals and so on. So we really think this needs to be questioned when beginning a research. But this also questions the social science in general, like why only the specialists of migration studies study migrations, while the others, for instance, will ignore migrants when speaking about other subjects and so on. So it's also the idea of reading like taking from the Arabian Peninsula to also question social science that is not specifically on the region, I think.
Thank you. Picking up on that last point on what researchers going into the region should be thinking about, sort of the critical apparatus that they should be mobilizing in the study of the region. I wonder if the three of you could speak about some of the more promising trends that you see in the anthropology of the Arabian Peninsula. And for the listeners here today who are sort of making their entry into the region, what sort of advice might you have for them in terms of how to think about their projects?
I think we should acknowledge that Amelie is a sociologist, by the way. That was actually one of the...
Sorry.
interesting conversations we had in the book, but I won't speak for you, Amelie, but I hope it's okay to point that out.
Yeah.
Well, we have like very similar methods. It's like you're an honorary anthropologist to us, so just by the way, we nominated you for a prize in anthropology. So I'm kidding, but you're one of us now. So I don't know who was supposed to I speaking here, but I probably shouldn't start here. Maybe someone could start.
I can start. I've been really impressed with graduate student panels that I've been on or attended at Mesa, where the kinds of frameworks that we're criticizing here, I think are not as taken for granted in the way that graduate students are formulating their research projects. I also, like very small things that make a really big difference. For example, like referring to non-citizens as immigrants rather than as foreigners or as migrant laborers, I think really like takes the exceptional out of the Arabian Peninsula region. It's not that the Arabian Peninsula is the only place where an immigrant cannot naturalize, right? So I've seen, that I've been on a couple of, I've participated in one and been an audience member in another. The Oxford and Cambridge Emirati Society has put on some excellent webinars exploring things like race in the Gulf and the question of like permanence for immigrants. I think that these are conversations that are being had more and more, not just in the US Academy, but also internationally. And we see a lot more scholars from the Gulf circulating within academia. And that's also something that I find really promising. I feel like a lot of the knowledge production has been, from the outside towards the Gulf, and it's very refreshing to see when people who have lived there, have grown up there, have their own perspectives to bring to the table.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. Thank you all for the book, which is a sort of critical tour de force, but also a manifesto for the ethnographic study of the region, both in anthropology and in sociology. And I apologize to Amelie for assuming that she was an anthropologist. In the US Academy, the ethnographic tradition in sociology is slowly being squeezed out by the more sort of quantitatively oriented people. And so apologies for making an assumption, but maybe Ahmed and Neha can get you at least a t-shirt or something. Okay, I'm going to open it up to Q&A now. For those of you who want to either send a question to me in the chat box or use the raise hand function, which if you click on, I think it's on like participation or participant, it's on there somewhere. We already have a couple of